Off we go with the president. So the first question is, who is this person that can be the president of the United States? Very few requirements from the Constitution. You have to be 35 years old, have lived in the United States for 14 years, which is just a little bit higher threshold than what senators and members of the House require. However, with the president, they did manage to insert one more stringent requirement, and that is to be a natural born citizen, which means you are automatically a citizen when you were born. There's been some debates over the years with presidential candidates as to whether they actually were born on American soil. Do military bases count? What about if you're born on foreign soil? Well, all these things have kind of been, looked at and argued about, but basically it's figurative. So if you come out of the womb and are automatically a citizen, either by your parents being a citizen or being on American soil, you are a citizen. All presidents up to 2008 have been white, male, and Protestant, with the one exception being Kennedy, who was definitely white and male, but he was the only Catholic president that we've ever had. And then, of course, President Obama, the first minority president in the United States. Couple of ways you can become the president. Obviously, the most common way is through being elected. The Constitution grants unlimited four-year terms under the original Constitution, which means every 4 years you have to get yourself reelected again, but you could do it as many times as you could manage to pull it off. However, after FDR was elected 4 times, and it was clearly a mistake, they inserted term limits for 2 terms with the 22nd Amendment. Again, FDR is the only one to have served more than 2 terms, and that's what made it a mistake, by the way. He got elected to a 3rd term as the war was starting, and then his 4th election, when he was a dying man, was clearly a mistake, and people had gotten into just the rut of electing FDR. That's just the thing you do, and so that was a signal that we needed to put term limits in. Only 12 out of the 42 presidents have been reelected, though, and that's staggering to a lot of people. There have been a couple occasions when the Congress has intervened in presidential elections. Once in 1800 with the Jefferson-Adams election, and then in 1824, which was the corrupt bargain election with Jackson and John Quincy Adams. 1876 was kind of a backroom intervention of Congress where there was a deadlock in the Electoral College, and Hayes was allowed to be the president in exchange for the Republicans ditching the Reconstruction occupation in the South. There was also one other occasion when the Supreme Court got themselves involved in the presidential election, and that was in 2000, where they ruled that the recount was being done in a pretty much a haphazard way, and so they said we're going to revert to the original counts, which made George W. Bush get elected for the first time. You can also become president by the process of succession, and so for 10% of American history, we've had an unelected person be in the presidency, which means they were either vice president, or in the case of Gerald Ford, who wasn't even elected as the vice president, he was the 3rd in line, who elevated to the vice presidency when the vice president resigned, and then became president when Nixon resigned. But for 10% of American history, every 10 years, one of those years, we had a non-elected president in the White House. 1 in 5 presidents got the job when the president died or resigned. So all the assassinations that we've had, or deaths in offices, and then, of course, the one resignation by Nixon. Impeachment is another possibility for removing a president and having another president take office. However, has not happened. 2 presidents have been impeached, but have not been removed. And the Constitution says that Congress can remove a president from office when treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors have been committed. And remember, we'll take this opportunity to refresh on the impeachment process. There are 2 phases. The impeachment is the bringing of charges against the president. In other words, the president has been charged with some kind of treason, bribery, or high crime or misdemeanor. And in both cases, President Johnson and President Clinton, they were both successfully impeached. And a lot of people think to themselves that they were not because they didn't leave office. Well, the reason they didn't leave office is because the second phase, which rests with the Senate, they must convict the president on those charges that have been brought up by the House. So in both cases, Johnson and Clinton, they were successfully impeached by the House, brought up on charges, but were not convicted of those charges by the Senate. And in the case of Johnson, it was by one vote. The Constitution also allows for somebody to become president through the disability of the sitting president. This has not happened either, but it could have happened in the case of Woodrow Wilson after he got his stroke when he was selling the public on the Versailles Treaty and the League of Nations back in 1919. He was basically bedridden for the whole last year of his presidency. And had that happened later on after the 25th Amendment had gone through, he probably would have been deemed incapacitated, and the vice president would have assumed the role of presidency with all of its powers until the president was back to health again, which in the case of Wilson never really happened. And so there's a whole process in the 15th Amendment where the VP, in conjunction with the cabinet, they're writing letters and things, and they can take the president's place in certain cases, and it's not necessarily permanent either. They could step back down to the VP position if the president's health is restored. And that brings up the next issue is, what is the line of succession for the presidency? Because we could theoretically have a major catastrophe where the president dies and the VP dies too. What if they're riding on the same plane together, which they're not supposed to, or they're at a state dinner and a bomber blows the whole thing up? What happens if the VP dies? Well, the next in line would be the Speaker of the House, followed by the Senate pro tempore, and then after that, it starts getting into the cabinet secretaries, and that would be a major, major, major catastrophe, and let's just hope that never comes to pass. Let's move over now to the president's constitutional powers. These would be what we might consider his enumerated powers granted to him by the Constitution. And so we have various types. We would point to legislative powers and duties that the president has. These are things that allow them to work with Congress and making laws and policy. So they got to do a State of the Union address. They can recommend legislation to Congress, which is, what we mean by that is he would be coming up with the ideas, trying to set the agenda for what Congress is going to be passing. Remember, we talked about how a bill must be sponsored by somebody in Congress, but the idea can come from anybody. Well, usually that idea is coming from the White House. The Constitution, even though this never happens, can force Congress to convene or adjourn, and of course the president can sign or veto legislation. The president also has administrative powers. He executes the law, which means he signs it into law, and then it's his job to make sure that the law is being implemented and carried out the way it's supposed to be. Now, over the years, he has built a team called the bureaucracy, which we'll look at in a couple of sections from now, where their whole job is making sure the law is happening the way it's supposed to. He also gets to appoint personnel, nominate officials, will be cabinet secretaries and heads of departments and bureaus and things, and fill vacancies. So he has lots of what the business world would call human resources powers, but we call them administrative powers here in this case. He also has some judicial powers to grant reprieves or pardons to people who have been convicted of crimes, and one of his major powers is to nominate judges and justices. Of course, that has to be approved by the Senate. The president really separates himself from Congress in terms of powers because he ultimately holds almost all the national security powers in his hands, with a couple of situations where the Senate will step in and approve something like a treaty. So the president gets to make treaties, but the Senate has to approve of them. But he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Of course, in the old days, the way that was checked was the power of Congress to declare war, but we don't declare war anymore, and so that has made the position of the commander-in-chief even more powerful. To bypass treaties, what the president can do is issue or make a deal with another power called an executive agreement, which is more or less a handshake deal where they vow to do certain things with or for each other. And this is not binding as law, which means once the president leaves the White House, the executive agreement leaves with him. But it's a good political move because it allows the president to bypass Senate approval like a treaty would. And this is one example of what we'll see more of in a moment of what we call informal powers of the president. So it's not necessarily an executive or a constitutional power, but we'll list it here in the context of treaties and other foreign policy powers that the president has. He can issue national security directives, which are also not subject to congressional approvals. So in other words, whenever we have a national emergency, the president's powers expand and he can direct traffic. And that could be everything from a terrorist attack to a hurricane that plows through a major city. And that's why you'll hear every now and then the president or a governor of a state declare a national emergency or a state emergency, because once they do that, that kicks in their expanded powers. And then one other thing the president can do foreign policy-wise is nominate and receive ambassadors. Now, here's where it gets a little bit into the gray area. The framers didn't want another king when they were making the Constitution. However, they wanted to have a president with enough authority to actually get stuff done and have it mean something. But they did envision a much simpler president than what the president has become. And I think most would agree we still don't have a king. We've managed to make the president somewhat subject to the approval of the people and some subject to the rule of law, and we don't have anybody as president issuing decrees like we have in other countries. So I think it hasn't got completely out of control, but we can definitely say that the president is far more powerful than the framers ever envisioned. But they put these checks and balances on him to make sure of that, like the ones I mentioned before. He can be commander-in-chief, but he can't declare war. He can make treaties, but he has to be approved by the Senate. He can make appointments to the courts, but that has to be approved by the Senate. And he can be impeached as well. And that was another major check. And, of course, you have to keep getting yourself elected, which means you have to have at least some kind of connection to the people. But even with all that, despite all that, the presidents have managed to expand their power through the use of informal powers. So these are powers that are not in the Constitution, and it makes relative sense that the president would be able to do them, but these are where we get into the gray areas where some presidents will pounce on their ability to do these things, even though it's not real clear if they were supposed to do it or not. So I already mentioned executive agreements. That would be one example of an informal power, but also being a party leader, like Jefferson was back in the early 1800s, becoming a representative of the people, being able to have the bully pulpit and speak directly to the people. Jackson was one of the first to do that. Being a war president, yeah, sure, you're commander-in-chief, but what does that do for you politically? Lincoln really showed how much leverage you have as president when you are basically waging a war. Teddy Roosevelt is the first one to launch public policy. Ever since him, the president has been directly involved in domestic affairs, making new policies for health and safety and the public welfare. Wilson expanded the role of the president as a diplomat. He personally went to Paris to negotiate the peace treaty after World War I. And ever since then, the president has been richly immersed into foreign affairs. And then, of course, FDR, through the New Deal, in the midst of the Depression, became the first economic policy president. And ever since then, politically, as the president, you have to have a mastery of economic affairs. You have to do something to make sure the economy is either staying strong, or if it's not strong, you better do something to get it back on its feet. Now, whether the presidents should be doing these things or if it's even worthwhile doing these things, it doesn't really matter. It's the political power that you get. Because if you can say as a president, I need to be doing all these things and I should be in charge of these things, that gives you power. That gives you authority in all these various areas of life and politics. And so that's what we mean when the expansion of power keeps going. Every time a president pushes the envelope or goes the extra mile, future presidents inherit that informal power as well. And so that's why we are on a trajectory basically since the late 1800s where the president has become more and more powerful as the days go by. All right, what about the president's team now? The president is the chief executive of the executive branch. Remember, executive refers to the idea where you execute something. You're executing the law as president. That's your job. But over the years, the president has garnered a team to help him do that. As the chief executive, he's got all the helper executives too in the executive branch. So he gets to direct all the traffic of all those personnel that are overseeing the functions of how the executive branch is carrying out policy. So one is a constitutionally prescribed position. That's the vice president. Now, historically, the vice president has been a weak, disliked person. Sometimes the vice president is somebody that they were trying to keep under control, trying to keep locked up so that they wouldn't make a big fuss. At other times, it was somebody to balance the presidential ticket in the election. And really, half of what the vice president is helping the president get himself elected. And for the longest time, they didn't do anything. But as time has gone by into more recent periods, the vice president has taken on more of a public relations role. And so the president might assign the VP to take over certain areas or kind of be his wingman on certain important, urgent issues. And so the vice president is more visual, if that's a word, more in the limelight these days. You hear from him more, you hear about him more often than you used to. The cabinet is the president's team of secretaries that oversee major policy areas. Washington had 3 of these secretaries. Today we've got 14 of them. And that's a growing number, but you got to remember that there's thousands and thousands of people under these 14 cabinet secretaries in their departments. Now, the Constitution does vaguely prescribe that the president gets to fill these seats in what has become the cabinet. So these people are going to be kind of the right-hand men and women of the president in policy matters. The First Lady, the president's wife in almost all circumstances, there have been a couple of nieces in there and that's where we get the term the First Lady. But the wife of the president, their job in recent times has also to be kind of overseeing a certain area of life. They're not necessarily a policy maker, but they are going to do things like literacy and fight childhood obesity and fight drugs and addictions and things like that. So it's a position where the First Lady reminds the public that the president is a human being, that he has a family, and so they're more or less on camera to humanize the president. So definitely some First Ladies have been more vocal and had a little more authority than others, like Hillary Clinton, for example, or Eleanor Roosevelt, and others are relatively forgettable because they prefer to stay out of the spotlight. The ironic case is Jackie Kennedy, JFK's wife, who was a beautiful woman and well loved by the American people. And if there's any First Lady that you wanted to get out there in front of the cameras, it was her. But ironically, she was the one who said, "Get those cameras out of the White House. Get those cameras away from my kids. I'm a mom, and I'm going to run this family the way I need to. I don't care who the president is." So, you have a rich tapestry of different experiences for the first ladies over the years. All right, the president's closest policy-making team is called the executive office, which is actually more of a place where you have his teams of policymakers working in the executive office. So these offices assist the president in making policy decisions and implementing those policy decisions. Um, and these are usually relatively smaller circles. They may have tons of people working in these departments, but the people who are in direct contact with the president are very small, and they're people he can trust. They're people that he can and really get the truth out of. So, for example, the National Security Council is the team that briefs the president on all national security matters on a daily basis. And this was formed in the Cold War era to deal with the urgent matters dealing with the Soviet Union. So they make recommendations to the president on foreign policy and national security policy, and the only members that are privy to the information are the president, the VP, a couple of the secretaries, the National Security Advisor, and a few others. The Council of Economic Advisors came along immediately after World War II, at the beginning of the Cold War. Their initial job was let's plan things a little better with the economy so we don't wind up with another Great Depression. And that's a perfect example of things that come along at a certain time for a certain region, and then you never get rid of it. And it's become a major policy making visual for the public to see the president's always on economic matters. Well, if you know about economics, the president has a pretty small role about what happens in the economy. The business cycle and the stock market and those kinds of things have a much bigger role. But the president needs to put on a good show and make it seem like he's got experts on top of all economic matters, and they're making decisions and making the economy better for the public. So vote for me. So there's a couple of members on the Council of Economic Advisors. They advise the president on monetary policy matters, which is to say, get the economy rolling. They publish an economic report of the president on the economy and all the things the president's doing. Again, it's kind of a campaigning, public opinion piece to make the president seem like he's really on the ball. And then we have the budget team, which is called the Office of Management and Budget. This is the president's budget-making team, not to be confused with the CBO, who is the Congress budget-making team. And they're not really related at all, but they're going to help the president crunch the numbers and put out the reports for when the time comes to send Congress a draft of your budget. We also have the White House staff. Now, these would be, for the most part, non-political people who assist the president in the White House. And when I say assist the president, that means do your job and stay out of the way in many cases, but not all. There are some people who are very important on the White House staff, and the chief among them is the chief of staff, who is another wingman for the president, and they oversee the functioning of the White House altogether. And so a lot of the little departments in the White House are going to report to him. So we have some political offices that they're not necessarily decision makers on policy, and they're not necessarily helping the president make policy, but they're doing the information gathering and crunching numbers and crafting speeches and things like that that are going to help the president out in various political areas. You've got congressional liaisons who are communicating between the White House and Congress. The press secretary comes up in front of the cameras every single day. You don't want the president talking too much to the press because they might catch him and make him say something stupid. And so these press secretaries are what we call the mouthpiece for the president. They're saying things that the president would say if he was there in person, but they're going to do it in a much more crafty way. And so they talk to the press every single day. You got national security people. We've kind of mentioned them. Speech writers, support staff. These would be people running around, delivering things, carrying papers, communicating. You've got photographers and gardeners, kitchen staff, maintenance staff. It takes a lot of people to run one of the coolest houses in the world. Last thing for this section is this diagram that kind of helps to make a little more sense for the president's team. We can see the president is at the top of the flow chart. He's got his VP, he's got his first lady. We talked about the cabinet briefly in the context of the secretaries. The cabinet secretaries are going to be the ones who have the contact with the president. The chief of staff oversees the White House, and then we've got all the executive offices too. Now, we only took it to a certain degree here because in a future section, we're going to talk about the bureaucracy, where we could take this picture and really carry it out. If we go to the cabinet, with all those 14 cabinet secretaries, they oversee an entire government department where you've got hundreds and hundreds of offices and bureaus. This is where we're going to see things like the FBI and the IRS and NASA, what we call bureaucracies. And so those are coming. So this diagram will be expanded as we go a little bit further. But so far today, we kind of talked about the people that are around the president, aiding him in executing the law.